Do you hear that sound? It's not thunder. It's 1,000 oars striking the murky water of the Seine. Oar after oar, like heartbeats before a storm. The spring of 845. Hundreds of ships covered in black tar are approaching the very heart of the Frankish Empire, Paris. The city does not yet know that in a few days its walls will tremble from the cries of people who came from the north. But the main question is not this. How could 1,000 warriors make the entire West bend its knee? These people called themselves Northerners. They were dubbed Vikings, sea raiders who lived at the edge of the world. But there was no chaos in them, as in legends. The historian Abo, an eyewitness to the events, wrote, "They marched like one machine. Their cries and shield strikes were more terrifying than thunder." These words are not an exaggeration. The Vikings were not merely raiders, they were professional warriors whose discipline was forged on the decks of longships. These ships were called drakers, long, narrow vessels with carved dragon heads on their prows. Draker means dragon. They could move both under sail and with oars, entering even shallow rivers. Imagine 120 such monsters gliding through the mist of the Seine, like a pack of sea beasts ready to seize their prey. Their hulls were tarred black, and when dawn struck them with light, they looked like the steel bones of a giant risen from the sea. Archaeological findings from Roskilde confirm that such vessels could travel up to 100 kilometers a day. For the 9th century, this was an incredible pace, a speed equal to the march of modern armored vehicles. And all this, the strength of muscles, the coordination of hundreds of men accustomed to the cold winds of the North Sea. These warriors did not live on land. Their home was the ship, and their bed was a roughly stretched canvas in the rain. They were not going only for plunder. Paris was a symbol of wealth, a city with mighty walls and relics. It was the heart of the Franks, and if you conquered it, you conquered the empire itself. But why specifically in the spring of 845? Because the Carolingian realm was tearing at the seams. After the death of Louis the Pious, the power of his sons weakened. The borders were not held. Soldiers were not receiving their pay. This was a moment when even the most protected city could fall not from strength, but from fear. The main leader of the Vikings, according to chroniclers, was Ragnar Lodbrok, a name shrouded in legends. Historians debate whether he truly existed or if several leaders were hidden under this name. But the fact remains, in 845, an army of Northerners indeed invaded the lands of the Franks, led by a man whose name sowed terror from the mouth of the Seine to Paris. His army, about 1,000 warriors, their ships stretched for dozens of kilometers along the river. This campaign was not a spontaneous raid. It was a planned military operation. The Vikings knew in advance where the weak points were, where the river turned, where the current weakened. They did not go blindly. Their scouts in light boats, went ahead and returned with news. River reconnaissance tactics were a rarity for that time. It made them deadly even to those who considered themselves impregnable. But the most terrifying part was yet to come. After all, Paris, standing on the Ile de la Cité, surrounded by water and walls, seemed impossible to take by storm. However, the Vikings knew even the strongest stone would crack if struck at the right time and from the right side. And that time was approaching. The water in the Seine was heavy, murky, smelling of silt and decaying fish. It was along this river that the Vikings prepared to ascend to the very heart of the Franks. Their voyage was not a mad dash. It was organized almost like a 9th century military expedition, meticulously planned. Each vessel had its number, each warrior his place, each tool its order. This was not a pirate fleet, but a naval army. Modern researchers call such forces a landing coalition, an alliance of small detachments under one banner for a large prize. But back then, everything was decided by a simple word: duty. A Viking's duty was to seek honor and wealth at the edge of the world. At the center of the flotilla stood Ragnar's longship. Its prow was adorned with a dragon's head featuring carved teeth and bronze eyes. When the sun rose, this dragon seemed to come alive, reflecting light onto the water, and the entire river began to shimmer with a coppery gleam. This symbol was not merely an ornament. It was an amulet. Vikings believed that the image of a monster warded off evil spirits guarding foreign shores. But for enemies, this sign meant one thing: death was coming. Before setting sail, the Vikings prepared for weeks. According to chroniclers, they gathered at the mouth of the Seine, at the place where the city of Rouen is now located. There they repaired ships, increased food supplies, and checked their weapons. Their diet was simple: dried meat, cured fish, grain flatbread, and beer brewed with salted water. They ate rarely, but a lot. Archaeological data from excavations at Danish settlements show that an adult warrior consumed up to 4,000 calories a day. Their bodies were like machines, resilient, dense, without excess fat, created for rowing and combat. The main weapon of their discipline was not strength, but order. They trained to the sound of shield strikes, creating a rhythm similar to a drum roll. This rhythm was called hleyf, an Old Norse word denoting battle rhythm. In battle, it helped to maintain formation and act as a single body. Imagine 100 warriors moving in unison, their axes flashing in the air like mill blades. One's mistake could cost everyone their lives, so every step was honed, every command short, sharp, without room for doubt. When the fleet departed from Rouen, the river became their path into the heart of the enemy. 120 dracars proceeded in single file, like a link of giant serpent scales, curving in rhythm with the waves. On each ship, about 40 warriors, armed with spears, swords, and shields, adorned with patterns in the form of lightning and beasts. These patterns were not just decorative. They carried fylgja, a clan sign, a symbol of blood kinship. Losing a shield was considered a disgrace, equal to cowardice. Warriors placed their shields along the side, transforming them into an impenetrable barrier. Thus emerged the shield wall, a movable wall protecting the rowers from arrows. Accounts from French chroniclers, in particular a monk from Saint-Denis, describe how inhabitants of coastal settlements saw black sails long before the ships themselves appeared. The sails, soaked in tar, absorbed the light, and it seemed as if night itself was moving across the water. People abandoned homes, livestock, churches, everything they could just to escape that sound. A rumble, like the roar of a rock rolling down a mountain, an eyewitness wrote. These were not merely warriors, these were messengers from another world, where cold is stronger than fear. But their campaign was not only a military act, but also a religious one. Each time before setting sail, they performed sacrifices to the gods, Odin and Thor. Drops of the victim's blood flowed down the blade of the sword, and the Vikings believed that thus the weapon received the power of a conqueror. This belief made them fanatics in battle. They did not fear death. On the contrary, they considered it a reward. And so they went where others would have retreated. The term that best describes this mindset is berserk. This is what a warrior entering battle frenzy was called. Modern researchers compare this state to a trance-like aggression when a person stops feeling pain. According to chroniclers' accounts, such fighters bit their shields and rushed into attack first, not feeling their wounds. For the Vikings, this was a manifestation of spiritual strength. For their enemies, a nightmare. When the fleet entered the upper reaches of the Seine, Frankish scouts had already brought news of the invasion to Paris, but the city was not in a hurry to prepare for defense. Too often, rumors about barbarians turned out to be exaggerated. People believed in the impregnability of their walls, for Paris stood on an island surrounded by water. However, this very thing became its weakness. For those who came from the sea knew how to deal with water better than any defender. The first morning fogs began to envelop the river, and above it, like a premonition of a storm, a low, hoarse sound echoed, the sound of a horn made from a bull's horn. It was a rallying signal. And at the moment when the horn's echo dissolved into the damp air, Paris became the target for the most terrible trial in its history. Early on the morning of March 28th, 845, a thick fog hung over Paris. The river steamed, as if the earth itself was breathing. But from this haze came a hum, dull, even, like the beats of a giant heart. It was not thunder. It was oars. 120 dracars moved up the Seine, and on their sides stood bearded warriors in woolen cloaks, in helmets with iron bands. In their eyes, coldness and calculation. Paris saw the Northern Army for the first time not in legends, but in reality. The chronicler Abbo wrote that the river was covered with ships, like a meadow with flowers. This was not a metaphor. Eyewitnesses claimed that the vessels stood so densely that one could walk across them from bank to bank. Each dracar carried about 40 fighters, 1,000 warriors against a city where no more than 15,000 people lived. Paris seemed great, but the Vikings were trained to break the great. Their approach was methodical. They did not rush to attack immediately. First, reconnaissance. Light boats went ahead to study the fairway, depths, bridges, and towers. A key element of their military organization was the herd, a detachment of the closest warriors, the chieftain's personal guard. Ragnar had about 100 such fighters. They marched in the first ranks, clad in mail shirts made of woven iron rings. The weight of one such mail shirt reached up to 10 kilograms, but one could row, run, and fight in it. For a Viking, it was a second skin, protection, and pride. Archaeological findings from Birka and Trelleborg confirm that such armor cost a fortune, and only experienced warriors could possess it. From the bank of Paris, the ringing of bells was heard. The inhabitants prayed, reinforced the gates, hid valuables in monasteries. But the walls of the Ile de la Cité were not ready for a siege from the water. The city had 2 stone bridges connecting the island to the banks, and both became a vulnerability. When the first ships approached the bridges, the Frankish defenders tried to set them on fire. But the Vikings acted instantly. They knocked down the burning beams with arrows wrapped in wet leather and landed troops right at the foot of the bridge. Their cry shook the air, short, sharp, like a sword striking stone. The word by which the Northerners themselves called this first strike was holmgang. A literal translation means duel on an island. This was not just a fight, it was a challenge, a ritual for starting battle. Each first assault was perceived by them as a personal duel between the chieftain and the spirit of the city. They believed that if this strike was successful, fate itself would incline in their favor. Therefore, the first waves of attackers advanced with particular fury, sparing neither themselves nor the enemy. The Parisians responded with fire and spears, but the Vikings used cunning. They placed their shields in front of them, forming a shield wall, a living barricade. This formation was called Skjoldborg. It allowed them to move forward even under a hail of arrows. Shields, interlocked at the edges, formed a dome under which the warriors advanced, like an iron beast. Modern military historians compare this tactic to the infantry squares of the Napoleonic Wars, the very same principles of cohesion and mass pressure. When the bridges wavered, the Vikings burst onto the island. Chronicles describe how they tore down temple doors and broke altars. But their goal was not slaughter, but a demonstration of strength. They knew the Franks would pay a ransom. Paris was rich, and in this wealth lay its weakness. Greed and fear became their allies. Ragnar sent emissaries, 2 warriors with white shields. They brought a demand, gold for the city's life. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, was then in Saint-Denis, a few miles from Paris. He understood. The army would not have time to gather. His soldiers were scattered. The counts argued among themselves, and the spring floods made the roads impassable. He had no choice. Negotiations began, but time dragged on. The Vikings used every minute to consolidate their positions. They erected a camp on the northern bank, in the place where the La Valette quarter is now located. Hundreds of canvas tents stood there, smoke from bonfires rising into the gray sky. Archaeological finds of charcoal and weapon fragments in this area indeed confirm the presence of Scandinavians. Their camp was built on the principle of a camp grid, straight rows with a central bonfire for assemblies. These were not savages, they were engineers of war, using geometry to survive. But in the heart of Paris, hope still flickered. Monks and townspeople gathered their last strength, hoping for a miracle. On the other bank, Ragnar sat by the fire, looking into the smoke where the city's silhouette was reflected. He knew the decisive day lay ahead, and if the Franks wouldn't pay, he would make them do it with blood. On the third day of the siege, Paris fell silent. The bells ceased. The smoke from the bonfires drifted over the water. The Vikings no longer attacked, and the townspeople decided that the storm had passed. But silence from the Northerners always meant one thing: preparation for a strike. In the morning, fog enveloped the river, and when it cleared, the Franks saw a sight that made their blood run cold. The Viking ships stood in a wall, their sails gleaming with copper, and on the prows of the Drakars the heads of sacrificed bulls blazed. This was a ritual of intimidation. They came not just to wage war, they came to execute judgment. Historians describe that the Vikings acted like masters of psychology. They used a show of force, an ancient intimidation tactic preceding an attack. This method was known among Germanic tribes and later received the Latin name demonstratio potentiae. The essence is simple: to make the enemy break before the fight even begins. The Parisians saw the Northerners striking their shields with spears, creating a hum as if thunder was approaching. This sound could be heard even beyond the walls of St. Stephen's Cathedral, where women and children had taken refuge. For them, it was not the sound of people, but the breath of a monster. Ragnar's warriors formed ranks on the shore. In the center of the camp stood a wooden pole, a symbol of the god Odin. On it hung shields, swords, and helmets of fallen enemies. This was their Huv, a place of sacred oath-taking assembly. Here, Ragnar raised his hand and spoke words that chroniclers convey with horror. "He who retreats shall not see Valhalla." His eyes gleamed, and even the oldest warriors lowered their heads. This was the moment when men turned into a storm. When the signal horn sounded the attack, the earth seemed to tremble. The first wave struck the western gates of the island. Frankish defenders, armed with long spears and crossbows, tried to hold the line, but the onslaught was unstoppable. The Vikings moved in a wedge formation, the so-called swine's snout. This tactical maneuver, known as svinfylking, allowed them to break through defenses with a narrow but powerful thrust. Each warrior leaned against the back of the one in front, creating pressure with the entire mass. The first ranks broke under the weight of bodies, shields cracked, spears bent like reeds. The chronicler Nithard wrote, "And it seemed as if the river itself was pushing these people onto the shore." The Vikings burst into the city with shouts, and the smell of burning tar mixed with the smoke of torches. But they did not burn everything indiscriminately. They sought symbols of power, gates, temples, palaces. Their task was psychological, to demonstrate that Paris no longer belonged to the Franks. The resistance held until evening. The Frankish captain, Count Odo, attempted to rally a militia, but forces were scarce. Chronicles assert that he fought on the bridge until he was wounded by an arrow in the shoulder. His courage later became a legend, but then it did not save the city. By night, the Northerners controlled both banks, and the Franks were trapped on the island, surrounded by water and the enemy. The Vikings set up catapults made from trees cut on the spot. These simple machines hurled stones and burning barrels of tar. This was an early analog of Greek fire, and although the composition was primitive, the effect was terrifying. Flames spread across the water, creating the illusion that the river itself was burning. Contemporaries wrote, "The Seine was red as blood, and even fish leapt out of the fire." When it seemed that all was lost, messengers emerged from the camp, again with white shields. They carried a final warning. King Charles the Bald understood. Further resistance meant the demise not only of the city, but of the entire realm. Secret negotiations began. According to chronicles, the Vikings demanded an enormous sum, 7,000 pounds of silver. This figure was staggering. For context, this was the weight of almost 3 tons. It was equivalent to a whole year's taxes from several provinces. Paris faced a choice: fall or pay. But the Franks stalled for time, hoping the storm would subside on its own. And then Ragnar decided to play his last card. He ordered the sails to be raised and made it appear as if the fleet was heading downriver. Paris breathed a sigh of relief. But at night, the ships turned back under the cover of fog. When the morning light colored the water, the Vikings were once again beneath the walls. This maneuver, a feigned retreat or false maneuver, was known even among steppe nomads, but the Northerners applied it with perfect precision. Fear gripped the city. They understood. These people could not be reasoned with. They could only be appeased with silver. That day, the Seine fell silent. The Drakkars stood motionless, their rain-soaked sails swaying heavily in the wind. Paris trembled, and everything depended on the decision of one king. And the Vikings knew patience is also a weapon. And finally, the courtyard of the bishop's residence. There were relics, silver chalices, and, most importantly, a gold treasury. When the Northerners burst in, they did not unleash a massacre. They acted dispassionately, like merchants who had come to collect a debt. The city was defeated but not destroyed, and this was part of the plan. Ragnar understood that power lay not only in swords but also in fear. He ordered prisoners, townspeople, monks, guards, to be displayed along the bank. They were not killed but kept in such a way that Frankish sentries could see them from afar. This was a signal to Charles the Bald. We control your city. Chronicles relate that then, in late March 845, the king for the first time sent envoys to the Viking camp. They were accompanied by the Bishop of Saint-Denis, a man accustomed to speaking the language of power and gold. Negotiations lasted several days. The Franks tried to stall for time, hoping that counts from Beauvais and Orléans would arrive with reinforcements. But the river was in flood. The roads were washed out, and no detachment could make it in time. The Vikings, meanwhile, fortified their camp, built a palisade, and began to melt down acquired iron and repair ships. Archaeological findings indicate that the Northerners indeed had blacksmith workshops right in their field camps, a rarity for the 9th century. This shows their level of self-sufficiency. They were an army, not a band of robbers. When it became clear that no help would come, Charles the Bald made a decision that determined the fate of Paris. He agreed to pay the ransom, 7,000 pounds of silver. This is about 2.5 tons of precious metal. For comparison, with such money, one could build several monasteries or arm an entire army. But the king chose gold over blood. The historian Abbo wrote, "He bought peace, but sold honor." However, for Charles, this was the only way out. Otherwise, Paris would have burned. The ransom was delivered by ships along the Seine. The silver cargo was unloaded directly at the Viking camp under the supervision of their chieftains. Chronicles claim that Ragnar personally received the coins and jewelry, testing them with his teeth, as if wanting to make sure that peace was truly worth being concluded. After the last chest was handed over, the Northerners raised their sails. The Seine once again filled with the roar of their oars. They departed as suddenly as they came. But their departure did not mean defeat. On the contrary, it was a triumph. In a few weeks, 1,000 Vikings brought the greatest city of the Frankish Empire to its knees and forced the king to pay. Paris became a symbol that even the richest capital could fall, not by the sword, but by the determination and calculation of foreigners. After this campaign, Ragnar's name entered legends. Scandinavian sagas claim that he left Francia laughing and told his men, "We took gold from the king, but we took more, his fear." And indeed, fear became the main legacy of this campaign. The Franks began to build fortresses along the rivers, strengthen garrisons, and introduce taxes for protection against the Norsemen. But the wave had already risen. The Vikings understood. The riches of Europe were accessible to those who knew how to take them, and Paris, though not burned, became the first warning. 40 years later, others would return. Not 1,000, but tens of thousands, and then the city would no longer escape with silver. But that is a completely different story. Gold instead of blood. After the payment, Ragnar and his warriors sailed down the Seine. Their ships sailed under full canvas, and on their prows hung trophies, shields with the coats of arms of Frankish knights. Paris remained intact, but its heart had been struck. The townspeople watched as the silver, earned by the sweat of their brows, disappeared over the horizon, carried away by the wind and the will of the Northerners. For the Frankish Empire, this defeat became a turning point. Charles the Bald, who had bought peace, understood. Rivers were open gates to the heart of his state. He ordered coastal towns to be fortified, chains to be laid across river mouths, and a patrol fleet to be created. But all this was too late. The Vikings had tasted power, and a wave of new campaigns swept over Europe. 10 years later, they would appear on the Loire. 20 years later, near Angers. 40 years later, again, at the walls of Paris. Chronicles state that Ragnar himself soon died. According to one version, in captivity of King Ela, thrown into a pit of snakes. But in people's memory, he remained not as a man, but as a myth. His name became a banner for subsequent generations. Scandinavian sagas added poetry to reality. It was said that, leaving Paris, he remarked, "We did not destroy the city because we want to return." And they did return, his sons, his heirs, those who built new dracars, inspired by their father's victory. For Paris, that year was a lesson. Walls do not save if there is no resolve. But for the history of Europe, the beginning of a new era. The campaign of 845 became the prologue to the age of the Norsemen. They not only plundered, but also settled. In Normandy, in England, in Ireland. They changed the map of the continent, and their descendants, from Rollo to William the Conqueror, would shape the destinies of kings. It all began here on the River Seine, when 1,000 Northerners showed the world that power could come from the sea and rewrite history anew.